Okay, so now we need to start down the rabbit hole and discover what magnet is. What is magnetism? What are we talking about regards to inertia and acceleration and force and motion? Since there's no academic textbook out there or non-academic textbook that can actually tell you what a magnet is, what is magnetism, how does so-called attraction and repulsion work, which doesn't exist. And here we are in the 21st century with our MacBook Airs and our MacBook Pros and endless satellites circling the Earth, and yet humanity still hasn't answered the fundamental question of the one loss of inertia, the one field modality that spans the entire universe. What is a magnet? What is magnetism? Well, a magnet is a spatial object. It is both coherent and polarized. Magnetism, obviously, is the innate polarity common to all phenomena, all atoms in the universe, including hydrogen. So, when we look at a magnet here on the left, what are we talking about? We could easily imagine these to be two magnets conjoined. Obviously, now that we know that there's no such thing as attraction and repulsion, what are we talking about? Well, force is a clockwise or counterclockwise spatial vector. It's curvilinear. That's why there's no straight lines in the universe. Force has both magnitude and directionality, i.e. vector, i.e. the creation of space. So, how is the space any different around a magnet than it is between, say, two galaxies? Well, magnetism creates incoherent space, just as magnetism creates coherent space. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's really very simple. Polarized force and motion and inertia and acceleration are both referent to what is coherent or incoherent. When we talk about magnetic attraction or magnetic repulsion, what are we talking about? Well, what do you think exists between these two magnets? Love? What is reaching out into space? Since space is neither a field nor a force and can act on nothing, then what is the intermediary? What is the intermediary between these two magnets? Either accelerating or being pushed together, you actually feel force and motion. You bring two magnets extremely close together and let one go, it'll shoot across the room, right through the drywall if it's big enough, has enough mass. Point non-specific incommensurability. What are we talking about when we refer to polarity? A magnet does not have two poles. Well, I mean, what does that mean? Same thing as fluid dynamics, we're talking about space and counter space. Polarity is space, is force and motion, is location. Inertia is counter space, is inertia and acceleration, it is the medium, it is the ether. What is going on between two magnets, either accelerating or decelerating as they're being forced together by some physical means, is either inertia and acceleration or force and motion. There is no such nonsense as magnetic attraction or magnetic repulsion. A magnet is a spatial object that is both coherent and obviously polarized. Every atom in the universe is polarized. What does polarized mean? Polarized literally is nothing other than extrapolation of referent to space, i.e. force and motion. So, what is this little part in the middle of this magnet? North pole here, south pole. It doesn't matter what pole it is. There is no pole on any magnet. That self-seeking center, not located at, but forced at and concentrated at, just as simple as simplex fluid dynamics, is counter space, inertia, the ether, the locus opposite to all space, all force and motion. Counter space, denotation and connotation is the antinomy of force and motion and location. Location is polarity. Okay, here we have polarity. Here we have the opposite of polarity, inertia. This cute little thing all these idiots refer to as the block wall is a dielectric inertial plane. Simple as simplex fluid dynamics. It is nothing more complicated than that. Space is multiplicative. Time is additive. So what are we referring to? Counter space is self-seeking. If I bring two of these magnets together and the dielectric inertial plane comes right to the middle of it, it actually forms before they're actually conjoined. What do you think is reaching? Space is not an intermediary for action. The ether is. There are only two principles in the universe: force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Soon we'll talk about the co-gravitational field and how it's able to alter the co-gravitational field, but we're talking about inertia and acceleration, or force and motion. Mass 1, mass 2. We can easily look at this single magnet as two magnets that have come together. Okay, you can actually see underneath the ferrocell or ferrofluid or magnetic viewing film, you can actually see the dielectric inertial plane forming before the magnets are actually conjoined. So, there's not a single academic textbook out there that can tell you what magnetism is or what a magnet is. We're talking about coherent and polarized. Magnetism creates incoherent space, just as gravity does not exist. I told you in a prior video that gravity does not exist. These two magnets coming together, what you incorrectly call acceleration, is nothing other. Inertia, what you incorrectly call attraction, is nothing other than inertia and acceleration. It is no different than gravity. Oh, well, what you're saying, well, only inverse poles can come together. You know, if I try to bring two poles together, obviously they will push apart, which of course is repulsion. It's not repulsion, it's force and motion. Inertia and acceleration, force and motion. So how does one conclude retroductively using simplex Platonic logic the fact that gravity does not exist? We're talking about matter ultimately. We're just talking about coherent matter versus polarized and coherent. All matter is polarized definitionally. Necessitatively so, it is polarized. Otherwise, this interatomic volume of magnetodielectricity wouldn't even exist. So how is it that gravity does not exist? Think. Please use your brains. Gravity is nothing other than incoherent counterspatial acceleration. Just as a moon towards the Earth, or the comet towards falling towards the Earth, or a meteorite falling towards the Earth, that is incoherent acceleration, counterspatial acceleration, versus this, which is coherent inertia and acceleration. There is no difference between magnetism and gravity. Gravity does not exist. Like I said, there's only two principles in the universe: inertia and acceleration, force and motion. It is literally that simple. Now over here on the right, we have force and motion. You actually have applied force to either mass 1 and mass 2 on either end. As you're pushing them together, you have ether rarefaction in the center. You have spatial compression. Force and motion are inverse to, necessitatively so, obviously, inertia and acceleration. You can actually see very, very brilliantly 90 degrees perpendicular on either side. I didn't draw it over on this slide, but over here I show it to you. You see the little inverse clockwise and counterclockwise hairs of the light, of the lines of light that's being scattered underneath the ferrocell. You know, you can actually see this, or actually to hold two magnets underneath the ferrocell and bring them together. You can actually see perpendicular to that. I knew it would exist there before I ever saw it. So once I got it, I was so glad to confirm what I knew was there. You can actually see projected out into space. Counter space has been displaced to the perpendicular. Why is that the case? Because in this case, I'm applying force to either one of these mass 1 and mass 2, in this case two magnets. I have ether rarefaction in the center here. Obviously I do not have counter space here. I have two like poles. Remember, force is a counterclockwise or clockwise coherent spatial vector. Force as both magnitude and directionality, therefore vector. We're talking about the creation of space, just compounding space. So, you actually have in the center here also spatial compression. You have blue shift. There's blue shift here in the center. But what you have, you obviously cannot see, is inertia, i.e. ether rarefaction. And what happens is, off to the perpendicular, you actually have a perfect mirage of a counterspatial sink in quote-unquote free space, to use that phrase loosely, on either side of both these magnets that are being pushed together. Why is that the case? Force applied to both ends. You have increasing compounding force and ether rarefaction in the center. So you have force, force, and force. The ether has to pop its head up somewhere. Just like taking a fat woman and throwing into a bathtub full of water, and she splashes water all out of the bathtub. Archimedes' principle of water displacement, measuring, it is the exact same thing. Simplex fluid dynamics, except in this case we're talking about inertia, i.e. inertia and acceleration, i.e. the ether, and force and motion. Interplay between the two. So I'm pressing these two together. You can actually see underneath the ferrocell, I've shown you in several videos, this, you'll actually see a projection, a mirage. It's not a mirage, it's a real projection. It's a real projection. It's a porthole in the ether to make things really simple and stupid so a 10-year-old can understand it. On either side of these two magnets that are being brought together. So, what is a magnet? What is magnetism? Magnet is a spatial object. It's polarized and coherent. Polarized force and motion and inertia and acceleration, by being coherent, you can actually see it on any magnet. The centrifugal edge, you have force and motion. The centripetal, you have inertia and acceleration. Returning to the counter space, you have polarized force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Only thing you have here that's different between normal mass with gravity is you have coherent bifurcation of force and motion of either quote-unquote pole, and likewise to inertia. You have the dielectric inertial plane, you have centripetal reciprocation, divergence, convergence. So all I've done in a magnet, any different than gravity, gravity does not exist. Gravity is merely a human contrivance, an extrapolation of incoherent magnetism. That's all it is. Gravity does not exist. Obviously you can say, well, that's certainly not the case. Things fall to Earth. But that's merely incoherent counterspatial acceleration. Okay? No different than magnetism other than it is incoherent. Can you think about that a second? Can you wrap your mind around it? It's literally that simple. I've actually termed this, I've never figured out all the stuff about magnetism and the rest of it. And I've got so much. I've got like 400 pages to add to the upcoming 4th and 5th book. It's just amazing. I never would have figured out any of this stuff if it hadn't been for Platonic retroductive methodology. If you're reading Plotinus specifically, Proclus, Numinus, Albanus, Platonic methodology is retroduction. Well, what is retroduction? Well, it's kind of simple. How is that different from deduction and abduction? Like deducing, well, that was the last place you saw a needle in a haystack. Well, I saw it over there. So you go rooting over in the haystack for the needle. You might find it 100 hours later. What is retroduction? Is working backwards. It's synthesis. You say, well, hay burns and the needle doesn't. You set a match with the whole haystack and poof, just in an instant, there's the needle. It's the ancient lost methodology of figuring things out by working retroductively. It's via negativa, or apophasis. I've actually termed it noumenal physics. The most important branch of physics does not exist today. I've termed it noumenal physics in opposition to phenomenal physics. Phenomenal physics obviously are endless huge equations. It's the measure of phenomena, or as I call them, bean counters. They count beans, but they have no idea what the fuck a bean is. Okay? I'm only interested in what is a bean, how is a bean, why is a bean. There's only one field. Magnetism is not a field. It is a field modality. It is the loss of inertia. Gravity does not fucking exist. Excuse my cussing. Does not exist. It is a human contrivance. The exact same sort of BS contrivance that existed for 4,000 years now, i.e. magnetic attraction or magnetic repulsion, does not effing exist. Period. No such thing as magnetic attraction and repulsion. A magnet is a spatial object that is polarized and coherent. As the Russians say, не только, но и тоже. Not only but also. Not only polarized but also coherent. Не только, но и тоже. Great little Russian saying if ever there was one. The Greeks have one as well. So, I wish it actually had a ferrocell. I knew this existed. I was so happy to actually see that that existed. I knew that if you had two spatial objects that were both polarized and coherent, i.e. two magnets, you're applying force on either end, and you have obviously force in the center, obviously what you're calling magnetic repulsion, which is not repulsion at all. You're actually compounding space. Remember, force is a magnitude and directionality vector, i.e. merely an extrapolation of the creation of space. Like I said, how is gravity any different than a magnet when it comes to space? Gravity, obviously, is an incoherent lump of whatever size, obviously creates incoherent space. Space is neither a force nor a field. It cannot act on nothing. Tesla said this. Others said this. Cannot act on anything. There's no such thing as space and time acting on anything. The entire two principles of the universe are divinely simple. This is why I've called it noumenal physics versus phenomenal physics. I'm interested in the being. What is the being? How is the being? Why is the being? Everybody else out there is counting fucking beans. And you have assholes like Richard Feynman later in his life. There's a famous video which I uploaded to my site. Richard Feynman answers, what is magnetism? Well, he sits and squirms in his fucking chair. He's got no clue. And he finally puts his hands together and he says, well, it's just too complex for you to understand. Well, go fuck yourself, Feynman. You're a bean counter. All these idiots out there are counting beans. They have no idea what a bean is. They count them. They add them. They subtract them. They put them over here on this side of the equation. They put them over here on that side of the equation. They don't answer the important questions like the ancient Platonists did. The ancient Egyptians. This is a lost art. I've called it noumenal physics. Space and time are posterior attributes of divergent force vectors, i.e. a loss of inertia, which in loss equals space and time. Space and time are not properties themselves, they are posterior attributes of something else. Just as illumination, i.e. divergence, i.e. magnetism as an analogy, is a field modality of light. So you have light and illumination. What is a posterior attribute of illumination? In our case, referring to space and time. Illumination necessitates shadows. Necessitates a lot of other stuff. Where there's one, there's the other. Je толка но и тоже. Necessitatively so. Reification of something that does not exist is impossible. Space and time do not act on anything. So space and time are posterior attributes of divergent force vectors, i.e. the loss of inertia. The loss of inertia necessitatively means the creation of space and time. The mirage of inertia. You have infinite space, or nearly so, seemingly so. This is just the necessitated byproduct of the loss of inertia. Force has a counterclockwise or clockwise spatial vector. It is curvilinear. That's why there are no straight lines in the universe. It is really that simple. So now we know that over this many thousands and thousands of years of private scratching caveman playing with lodestones, that magnetic attraction does not exist, magnetic repulsion does not exist, gravity does not flipping exist. It is that simple. Force and motion, inertia and acceleration. Here in counterspatial inertia and acceleration, you have force to a negative multiplicative exponent. Here, in quote-unquote magnetic repulsion, which is literally force and motion, where you have applied force on both ends, you have compounded spatial compression in the center, and you actually create a counterspatial displacement perpendicular to either side of the applied force to these two mass 1 and mass 2 objects. You have force to the positive multiplicative exponent. So, inertia and acceleration, you have force to the negative exponent, and on quote-unquote repulsion, i.e. force and motion, you have force to the positive exponent. At the center of this quote-unquote repulsion, for lack of a better term, since this is what you conventionally understand, you have the lowest potential and the highest force and motion. So what do you have over here in acceleration, i.e. quote-unquote attraction? You have the highest potential and the lowest force and motion. Force and motion are the inverse of inertia and acceleration. They are the negation of that. If you don't understand that, you're never going to understand anything. I frankly don't care what you understand. I do this for a few people and I do it for myself. Point non-specific incommensurability. What does that mean? Incommensurability is an ancient Platonic term that is so bloody important that it would take you a very long time to study it. It means no matter where you make it really simple. I'm trying to make this whole thing really so simple it's even stupefying me. I kind of dumbed it down. All of this I've dumbed it down so far that it's actually tripping me up because it's just it's just a little too oversimplified. I'm trying to find the most stupid analogies possible. Like wherever you cut it, it is the exact same. Self-similarity, just like a fractal. Just like this magnet, if I were to slice it, or this magnet, this real magnet over here, if I were to slice it top to bottom 1,000,000 times, the dielectric inertial plane will be right in the center. And why is that the case? Because polarity equals space and force and motion, i.e. location. The dielectric inertial plane is inertia. There are no north poles and south poles in a flipping magnet. Does not exist. Polarity necessitates clockwise and counterclockwise movement, but even the clockwise and counterclockwise necessitatively do not exist. It is merely a spatial extrapolation of polarity itself. It is a connotation of polarization. Actually, it's a denotation of polarization. That's why in the center right here, you can see it here. You can bring the magnet, 1,000 magnets together, or you can take the same magnet and cut it 1,000 times. The dielectric inertial plane will self-center. You have anybody trying to explain this in any academic textbook? No! I have every book on magnetism ever written. Nobody talks about this. Nobody explains it. They're all bloody bean counters. Well, you see this, and this happens when you do that, and you stick a carrot up a bunny's ass, it jumps up to the ceiling. You know, that's a description, you assholes. That's not an explanation. Wisdom comes where descriptions end and explanations begin. Understand that or understand nothing. So why are these two magnets accelerating towards each other, and why are these two magnets that are having applied force, why are they repellent? Of course, repellent is incorrect. I have force and motion here, inertia and acceleration. Is it love? Is it hate? What is going on? Oddly enough, no academic textbook has ever tried to answer that one either. Well, they give a nice explanation, though. But by nice, I mean pathetic and lame. And of course, Feynman does no better. He swiggles in his chair and he says, well, it's too complex. As a BBC reporter, he's interviewing Feynman. He's sitting in his Barca lounger and he's got his hands crossed. And people love this guy. I mean, they have their nose so far up his dead ass, it's not even funny. They're in love with that pathetic old asshole. Only because he had a great personality. Not because he had any wisdom or any sense. So, what is love? What is happening here? Love? Hate? What is going on? Nobody's explained it. Well, let's say, North Pole attracts the South Pole, and the South Pole attracts the North Pole, and two like poles. What is going on? What is a magnet, and what is magnetism? A magnet is a spatial object that is both polarized and coherent. Magnetism is the innate polarity necessitatively to exist in all phenomena, atoms, in the universe. Because any interatomic volume necessitates the loss of inertia. Ultimately, why is there any loss of inertia? That's a matter for another discussion. The equation for that, which I discovered 13 years ago, is this. 1 over 5 to the power of negative 3. Here's the grand unified theory, by the way, if you ever wanted to know what it was. It's 1 over 5 to the power of negative 3. People say, well, that's a number. That's 4.23606 or 5 cubed. It's not a number. It's an expression. It's an expression. It's not a number. How you arrive at that is an expression. The number itself is a number. But the expression in extrapolation is not a number. It's an expression for the necessitated loss of inertia. It's a secret I found in an ancient Platonic text. I actually copyrighted it 13 some years ago. So, polarity equals space denotatively, i.e. equals force and motion, equals location. Inertia equals counter space, equals inertia and acceleration, equals the medium. We've got a few more videos to do here. So we've talked about the fact that gravity does not exist, attraction and repulsion do not exist, a magnet does not have a north and a south pole. Polarity is nothing other than extrapolation of a referent. It is a contrivance, a referent to space, to location. Remember, weight is location specific, but not only location specific. We'll talk about this next. Weight is not only location specific, it is also medium specific. Like you can throw a 100-pound child in a big pool of water and weigh him. How much does he weigh in the water versus on the land? You instantaneously change location in space. You instantaneously change weight. Obviously, there's no particle interaction. So why is location, weight, location, and medium specific? And why does my device work? Here's one of the devices. We're talking about counterspatial displacement, a change in the co-gravitational field, force and motion, inertia and acceleration. You understand that? I'd actually change the weight of something by not only changing its for lack of a better term, its perceived location. You actually created a mirage of its location. It'd be located here, but you've actually changed its location vector up here. Not really, but you've caused that projection by projecting a counterspatial inertia perpendicular to the accelerating object of mass 1 to mass 2. Not only that, you've also changed its medium. You've also changed the medium which surrounds it, and therefore you've changed its footprint, for lack of a better term. So, space, counterspace, force and motion, inertia, acceleration. Gravity does not exist. Attraction, repulsion do not exist. There is no North Pole and no South Pole in a magnet. None. There's only space and counterspace. Obviously, a magnet is a physical object. What are we talking about here? Show me a magnet that isn't a physical object. Look, there's a big old magnet. Space and counterspace. What do we see here? Right in the center of that magnet. If I slice it 1,000,000 times, it will always be in the middle of every slice. What's going on there? Love, attraction? Ridiculous. Space and counterspace. So the antinomy of space and force and motion is counterspace, simplex fluid dynamics, displacement. Like I said, it's like throwing a big fat chick in the water. She displaces the water. The ether, inertia and acceleration, force and motion operate no differently than simplex fluid dynamics, except on a different scale and with a different medium. That medium is obviously the ether. Inertia, potential versus the actual. Space and time are posterior attributes of a field modality of divergence. Space and time are posterior attributes of divergent forces. The divergent force vectors, i.e. the loss of that inertia, which is the loss of inertia expressed as space and time. Space and time do not act on anything. They are neither fields nor forces. It's like saying a shadow could act on something. Well, I mean, someone could be scared to death by a shadow thinking it's a snake. The same way space and time can cause someone to worry to death about getting old, but ultimately space and time do not act on anything. Force and motion, inertia and acceleration. There's only one field. Remember, there's only one field, and it's expressed in modalities of its divergence. But, however, space and time act on nothing. They create nothing. They do nothing. They have nothing to do with gravity, which doesn't exist, and it has nothing to do with acceleration. It has nothing to do with the rest of it. Another video coming. Obviously, this was a long one. Loxi Veritas.